I was just trying to fix the coffee machine. That's it. But somehow, that ordinary task had become a trap for my own curiosity and my own nerves. My hands were sticky with syrup and coffee grounds, and I could hear the shower running next door. She had gone to shower, leaving the apartment quiet, except for the hum of the hot water and the faint click of her shampoo bottle. And then she was there. Not my girlfriend, but her sister. She leaned against the counter, close enough that the warmth from her shoulder brushed mine. "Look at me instead," she whispered, and I almost dropped the screwdriver. I froze. My heart was doing something uneven, like it had forgotten its own rhythm. She didn't step back, didn't smile. She just watched me, quiet, confident, the kind of presence that doesn't need words to fill a room. And I didn't know how to look anywhere but her eyes. It was absurd. I knew I shouldn't be feeling this, not like this. But there was something magnetic about her. Something calm, yet chaotic. She had this air of knowing exactly who she was, every movement precise, every glance deliberate, but also this softness that made me feel like I could fall into her without warning. I tried to speak. Something like, but the words stumbled out wrong, like they always did around her. She tilted her head slightly, just enough for her hair to catch the light and fall in a golden cascade over her shoulder. I noticed the little details, the curve of her wrist as she rested it on the counter, the faint scent of vanilla and soap that lingered even though she'd been in the shower. For a second, the world outside the kitchen, the apartment, the mess, the coffee grounds, disappeared. There was just her. And me, staring like an idiot, wondering if I should move, speak, or just admit that I couldn't stop looking. Her lips parted slightly, almost a sigh, as if she'd been waiting for me to notice. She didn't rush me, didn't push. It was like she wanted me to unravel in silence. My hands twitched, still holding the screwdriver like it might anchor me, but it didn't. Nothing could. Then she smiled, almost imperceptibly, but it was enough to ignite something in me I hadn't realized was waiting. Not desire, not yet. Something quieter. Something electric. Like a question with no words, a moment suspended between don't and please. I blinked. And suddenly, she was moving away, letting the space between us expand just enough to remind me that I wasn't supposed to feel this way. She leaned lightly against the counter, casual, but I knew the calculation behind it. Every gesture mattered, every pause intentional. I wanted to ask her something, anything, but my voice betrayed me. I cleared my throat and muttered something about the coffee machine, trying, and failing, to anchor myself back in the ordinary. She hummed, an amused, almost imperceptible sound, and walked to the fridge like she had nothing to do with the tension crackling in the air. But I couldn't look away. Even as she opened the fridge and her back was to me, I kept thinking about that whisper, the way her presence filled the room, and how impossibly aware she seemed of the chaos she'd left in me. And as the water stopped running next door and my girlfriend stepped out of the bathroom, I realized I was still staring at her sister, my mind unwilling, or maybe unable, to let go of the moment. I didn't understand it. I couldn't explain it. But I knew, with a sudden, frightening clarity, that I wouldn't stop thinking about it. I hadn't meant to spend the afternoon at her apartment again, but the coffee machine was officially beyond me. She sighed when I walked in, leaning against the counter with that same calm authority she always carried, as if she had all the time in the world and I was just background noise. "Thanks for coming," she said softly, rubbing the bridge of her nose. She didn't look at me, just focused on the machine like it had personally offended her. I nodded, carrying the toolkit over, careful not to make any sudden movements. Every time I moved, I felt like I was intruding on some private orbit I wasn't supposed to inhabit. We worked in silence at first. I studied her without trying to, her fingers nimbly twisting screws, the faint tremor in her hand as she reached across the counter. She was precise, but there was fatigue etched into the curve of her shoulders and the line between her eyebrows. She had this tendency to absorb everything herself, and I felt a pang of something tender I couldn't name. At one point, she paused, leaning back with a small sigh that I could almost hear over the soft ticking of the clock. Her lips pressed together like she was holding something back. I cleared my throat. Do you want me to?" She shook her head, and there was a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes before she masked it with a brief smile. "No. I've got it," she said, but the edge in her voice betrayed the exhaustion I didn't think she'd let anyone see. I caught the faint tremor in her hands when she reached for the screwdriver. She bit her lip, glanced at me quickly, then focused back on the machine. I wanted to say something reassuring, but my words felt small against the quiet gravity of her presence. Instead, I watched her, memorizing the subtle angles of her face, the way her hair fell over one shoulder, the way her laugh, soft, unguarded, escaped when a screw slipped and clattered to the counter. It was strange, the way I felt. Drawn to her, yes, but also protective, anxious not to overstep, yet desperate to notice her in a way that felt real, not intrusive. Every glance, every shared pause, seemed weighted with something unspoken. Finally, she leaned closer to examine the machine, and our shoulders brushed. A spark, quiet and contained, traveled from that brief contact straight to my chest. I felt my own hands tense, unsure whether to retreat or reach out. She didn't flinch. She just exhaled, and I noticed the faint scent of the soap she'd used in the shower earlier, lingering like a secret between us. She straightened, meeting my eyes for the first time in what felt like hours. There was a softness there, but also caution. Something about her told me that, despite the closeness, she held herself back, as if stepping too far would break some invisible rule. And yet, the corner of her mouth quirked in a half-smile. I felt the room shrink to the distance between us, quiet, heavy, waiting. I wanted to speak, to ask her if she ever let anyone see this part of her, the fatigue, the subtle cracks that made her human, approachable, yet untouchable. But I didn't. Instead, I just stayed there, shoulders nearly brushing, heart speeding, noticing her completely. And in that moment, the air between us was taut with a gentle, forbidden energy, a pull I knew I couldn't name but couldn't ignore. It was late, later than I thought I'd stay. The apartment was quiet, except for the occasional hiss of rain against the windows. She had insisted on finishing some paperwork at the kitchen table, and I was helping, though it felt more like I was just sitting there, watching, trying not to breathe too loudly. She moved with that same deliberate grace, pulling documents toward her, tapping a pen against her lips. Her sleeves were rolled up, revealing the soft curve of her forearm, and I couldn't stop myself from noticing. I caught a glimpse of her hand shaking slightly as she wrote a note, and my impulse was to reach out, steady it, but I didn't. I didn't dare. "Did you ever?" I started, voice catching, then stopped. The words didn't make sense even to me. She glanced up, eyebrows raised, curious but patient, waiting for me to finish. But I couldn't. Some part of me knew it wasn't the time, or maybe it was too much. I swallowed, the tension between us almost unbearable, and forced myself back to the documents in front of me. Her phone buzzed on the counter. She picked it up, and I glimpsed the name before she silenced it. An ex, maybe, though she didn't answer. The pause, the brief flicker of hesitation in her eyes, was enough to make my chest tighten. I wanted to ask, to bridge the gap, but I stayed silent. The unspoken rules were louder than any words I could say. We returned to the papers, our shoulders brushing accidentally, or not, and for a heartbeat, the world outside the apartment ceased to exist. The rain tapped against the window like impatient fingers, the kitchen light dim and warm, casting shadows that seemed to hug the corners of the room. My hand twitched toward hers, almost as if to steady her, to close that tiny space between us, but I pulled it back, letting restraint win over impulse. She hummed softly to herself, a tune I didn't recognize, and I noticed how tired her eyes looked, the subtle way her lips pressed together whenever she concentrated. I wanted to say something comforting, something that might ease that weight, but I didn't. Instead, I just kept my gaze on her, memorizing the lines of her face, the tilt of her head, the way her hair fell like a shadow over one side of her cheek. Then she laughed quietly at something on the paper, soft, unguarded, and it was like the room tilted. I leaned a little closer, maybe too close, drawn in by the sound, by the closeness, by the pull I couldn't resist. She glanced up at me, and our eyes met, long, silent, loaded. For a moment, I thought, maybe this is it. Maybe we crossed this invisible line. My chest thumped, my fingers itched to brush a stray hair from her face, to reach just a little closer, to close the space that shouldn't exist. And then her phone buzzed again. She picked it up, eyes shifting, focus breaking, and the spell shattered. My hand froze mid-air, hovering uselessly, tethered by restraint. I swallowed the frustration and the longing, reminding myself that this wasn't the moment, yet. But the air still hummed. The rain still tapped. And I knew I would be thinking about this, about her, about the impossible closeness we just shared, long after she looked down at the phone, and the night pressed forward, indifferent. We were sitting on the worn couch in the living room, rain still drumming softly against the windows. The coffee had gone cold hours ago, untouched, and I realized neither of us had moved to refill it. I could feel her presence like a weight beside me, close but untouchable, and the silence between us was almost unbearable. I wanted to speak, to break it, but every word felt inadequate. Instead, I just watched her, how her fingers traced the seam of the cushion, how her shoulders hunched slightly, like she carried something she couldn't name. She didn't look at me, and yet I felt the tension in her spine, the quiet pull of her awareness, like we were orbiting the same invisible star. Finally, she exhaled, a slow, measured sound that seemed to vibrate through the room. "Do you ever wonder what we're doing?" she asked, voice low, almost a whisper. Her eyes didn't meet mine, but I felt them cutting right through me, searching, questioning, vulnerable in a way I wasn't prepared for. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to laugh it off, to say, "We're just sitting here," but the truth was heavier than that. Yeah, I admitted finally, voice tight. "I do." She shifted, finally turning to look at me, and for the first time, the careful mask she always wore faltered. There was uncertainty there, maybe even fear. "Because it doesn't feel normal," she said, the words trembling. "And I don't know if that's a problem or if it's something else." I felt a lump rise in my throat. "I know," I whispered. "I feel it too. It's confusing." My hands itched to reach out, to touch her, to bridge the space that had become unbearable, but I didn't. I couldn't. We sat like that, quiet, the room humming with unspoken thoughts. Every so often, her gaze flicked to mine, and I saw flashes of everything. Desire, regret, hesitation, longing, all tangled together in a way I wasn't sure either of us could untangle. The clock ticked loudly, marking the slow crawl of time. I wanted to ask her to define it, to name it, to give the chaos a label. But I didn't. Instead, I just watched the small movements, the way her fingers flexed against the couch, the subtle tilt of her head, the way her breath caught just slightly when she exhaled. She leaned back, closing her eyes for a moment, and I could see the tension in her jaw. "I don't think I've ever been this aware of someone," she said softly, almost to herself. "Not like this. And I don't know what to do with it." My chest tightened. The weight of the moment pressed down on me, heavy, real. I opened my mouth, closed it. There was nothing I could say that wouldn't shatter what little control we had left. And then she whispered, almost breaking, almost crumbling, "I don't want to ruin whatever this is, but I don't know if I can stop thinking about you." The words hung in the air, raw, unpolished, devastating. I couldn't move, couldn't respond, couldn't even breathe properly. All I could do was sit there, feeling the pull, the impossibility, the vulnerability that suddenly made everything irreversible. It was late afternoon when she finally let her guard slip. We were tidying the living room together. Well, I was tidying, she was hovering somewhere between distracted and lost. Her phone buzzed again, but this time she ignored it, letting it rest face down on the coffee table. I noticed a small, crumpled envelope near the couch, one she hadn't mentioned. She picked it up without comment, sliding the seal open carefully. Her fingers lingered on the paper, trembling just slightly, and I realized she wasn't just looking at it, she was revisiting something. Something old. I haven't seen this in years, she murmured, almost to herself. She unfolded the letter slowly, and I saw her eyes soften, glisten, then tighten. There was a pause, a long, deliberate exhale, before she finally spoke to me. It's from him. From a long time ago. I didn't ask who. I didn't need to. There was something in her voice, hesitant, fragile, with a thread of sorrow, that told me it mattered more than I could fully comprehend. I didn't think I'd ever read it again, she said, tracing the paper with a finger. I thought I'd moved past it, but sometimes memories they sneak back in, don't they? I nodded slowly, not trusting my voice. I wanted to reach across, touch her hand, steady her, but I didn't. I could feel the intensity in the quiet, the weight of her past brushing against the present. It was intimate, dangerous, like peering into a corner of her heart she usually kept hidden. Did it hurt? I asked finally, careful, quiet. My own chest felt tight, as if even asking was trespassing. Her eyes flicked to mine, and for a moment I thought I saw shame, maybe regret. More than I could explain. I loved him, and then I lost him. Not just to someone else, but life. Circumstances, choices, I don't even know. I just lost him. She swallowed, blinked rapidly, and set the letter down. I think about it sometimes, even now. I didn't know what to say. There was no comforting line, no clever response. I just sat there, watching her, aware of the fragile pulse of truth between us. Her vulnerability was shocking, not in a dramatic way, but in a way that left me hollow, aware that she had entrusted me with something no one else knew. I wanted to tell her something, anything, to close the distance, but my own feelings tangled up with hers, and all I could manage was to sit still, noticing the small details, the quiet tremor in her hands, the faint scar of sadness in her eyes, the way she tucked a stray hair behind her ear absent-mindedly. Then she looked at me, and it wasn't accusation or expectation, just quiet, almost fragile acknowledgement. She didn't reach for me. She didn't need to. And yet the air between us shifted, subtle but seismic, like a fault line under calm soil. I don't know why I'm telling you this, she admitted softly, almost a whisper. Maybe because I trust you, or maybe because I shouldn't. I swallowed hard, feeling the gravity of her words sink into my chest. She leaned back slightly, the letter still in her hands, and for a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath with us. The rain outside softened, tapping lightly against the window, and I realized I was thinking about her, not just this moment, but all of it, everything beneath the surface I could see now. And in that silence, the pull between us deepened, not urgent, not defined, but undeniable. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just watched, feeling the impossible intimacy of what she had just shared, knowing nothing would ever feel the same again. The apartment was quiet in a way that felt full, not empty. Rain had stopped hours ago, leaving the windows streaked with the memory of storms, and the soft hum of the city outside was a distant whisper. We were in the kitchen again, but this time it didn't feel like work, didn't feel like chores or errands. It felt like we were exactly where we were supposed to be, even if it didn't make sense. She leaned against the counter, one hand wrapped loosely around her mug, the other brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. I stayed nearby, not knowing whether to sit, stand, or simply exist in the same space without breaking the fragile rhythm we'd found. "I'm glad you stayed," she said quietly, not looking at me but letting the words hang in the air. They weren't dramatic, weren't declarations. They were simple, real, and I felt them settle somewhere deep in my chest. I nodded, trying to swallow the lump that had been growing there for weeks. "I'm glad I stayed too," I said, because it was true, and it was enough. We worked in silence for a while, not because we had to, but because silence had become the only honest way to be near each other. I noticed the small things again, the faint curve of her lips when she thought no one was watching, the way her shoulders relaxed when she exhaled, the quiet steadiness in her hands as she stirred her coffee. At some point, we drifted closer without even meaning to. Her shoulder brushed mine briefly, and I didn't pull away. Neither did she. Our proximity wasn't urgent, wasn't desperate. It was deliberate, quiet acknowledgement that whatever this was, this tension, this understanding, this slow unraveling, was real. She glanced at me, a subtle question in her eyes, and I didn't answer. I didn't have to. My fingers itched for a moment, and on a small impulse, I let them rest lightly against hers as she set her mug down. It was nothing dramatic, barely there, but it was everything. Her hand twitched slightly against mine, almost a reflex, and I thought I saw a smile in the corner of her mouth. She didn't speak, she didn't need to. The moment itself, fragile, earned, quietly intimate, said everything. We didn't talk about what this meant. There were no promises, no plans, no declarations. We simply existed together in that space, our breathing aligning, our movements careful, our awareness of each other complete. It was honesty, not words. Connection, not spectacle. Finally, she leaned her forehead lightly against the counter, eyes closing, and I stayed close, letting my shoulder brush hers as I watched. The weight of everything, the longing, the restraint, the quiet pull that had brought us here, settled into a soft, undeniable inevitability. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, or maybe minutes. Time didn't matter. Nothing needed to be said. There was understanding in the silence, in the tiny touch of hands, in the shared presence that had grown from tension into something real and human. And when I finally moved to stand fully, to give her space without leaving, I realized that what had begun as curiosity, hesitation, and forbidden energy had quietly become something neither of us could deny, an unspoken agreement that, for now, we belonged exactly where we were. The quiet, at last, felt like home. Looking back now, it feels like it all happened in slow motion, like the universe allowed us to linger in each pause, each glance, each unsaid word long enough for it to matter. I think about that first moment, standing there while she whispered, "Look at me instead," and how something inside me shifted in a way I couldn't name at the time. We were careful after that. Careful with our words, careful with our gestures, careful with the tension that had grown between us like a delicate thread. And yet, with every shared smile, every quiet acknowledgement, every accidental touch, the thread pulled tighter, weaving us together in a way that was gentle, but impossible to ignore. I think about her more now, not the version of her I admired from a distance, or the untouchable confidence she carried, but the one I saw in fleeting moments, exhausted, vulnerable, and beautiful in her honesty. She taught me patience. She taught me that love, or whatever this is, doesn't always arrive with fireworks or grand gestures. Sometimes it arrives in the quiet acknowledgement of another person's existence, in the subtle alignment of two lives in a room filled with ordinary things. And I've changed too. I've learned how to observe, how to wait, how to recognize the gravity of a glance or the weight of a pause. I've learned that restraint isn't weakness, and that longing can be a gift when paired with understanding. I've learned to notice the small things that make someone who they are, the way she laughs when she thinks no one's watching, the softness in her voice when she trusts you, the careful way she carries herself even when life has been hard. It wasn't a perfect journey. There were hesitations, mistakes, moments of confusion and almost words. But the imperfect nature of it is what made it real. It's what made us real. And now, looking back, I see that what started as curiosity, tension, and something forbidden evolved into something unspoken but undeniable. We never needed grand declarations. We never needed to define it in words. We simply understood each other in the moments that mattered, the shared space in a quiet apartment, the light brush of hands, the acknowledgement of vulnerabilities without fear. What changed most, I think, wasn't just us, but my understanding of what connection can be. Love doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives softly, insistently, in the spaces between words, in the pauses, in the quiet recognition that someone else sees you in ways you didn't think anyone could. I don't know what the future holds for us. Maybe it's endless mornings with coffee and quiet glances. Maybe it's more moments of hesitation and wonder. But I do know this, I'll never forget the way it felt to exist in that space with her, to see her fully, to be seen fully in return. And sometimes, that's enough. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?